Hello, I'm Aidan from GTG Coaching. So today I'm going to go over one of the videos that I did, I think 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, and reflect back on it like we do in our normal coaching process to see what I would do differently now and what's sort of changed.
Hi, I want to talk today about the deadlift and go over the execution and setup of the deadlift. This video is basically for anyone who tends to struggle with their deadlift pattern, who tend to look like a scared cat or a dog taking a crap whenever they lift heavy loads in the deadlift. Maybe just struggle to get in the position or don't feel the deadlift in the right places, or maybe don't know where they should feel the deadlift. What it isn't is a video based around how to lift the most amount of load on a deadlift. Going through the setup and execution, 100%. The idea is you should still be able to lift a very heavy load, but what I mean by it's not targeted at lifting the heaviest load possible is that a lot of times, especially in say like a powerlifting style of deadlift or that kind of community, the goal is to lift the most amount of weight possible. So sometimes we will compromise form and technique in order just to lift the heaviest load possible. We'll not be going down that route. It'll be more in terms of what is the safest and most optimal setup in terms of lifting for longevity, being able to build strength for a long period of time and really minimize risk of injury. Still 100% be able to lift a lot of load. That's the main purpose of it, because we tend to use the deadlift at GTG Coaching essentially just to work on strengthening the posterior chain in people, so glutes and hamstrings, and really minimizing injury, teaching people how to move through their hips rather than their lower back. And usually when you see someone who suffers from lower back pain, one of the first things that goes is their ability to do a hinge.
Okay, so their ability to do a hinge, frequently that sort of diminishes. The one thing that's probably worth looking at there is if you partially you lose your ability to do a hinge from back pain, is working out if it's actually just fear avoidance. So most of the time, or not most, a lot of the time, people just become afraid to do an exercise because they've had an injury there. They avoid that movement, and then they get really weak at that movement, and then they're unable to do it, and then you challenge it and get injured again from fear, and also just because it's really weak. So definitely, but it's worth just looking at if you have had a lower back injury or issue, that the hinge can sometimes disappear because you just become afraid of that movement pattern, and you're just really, really tight and tense and kind of gripping because you don't trust you can do it without back pain. And then it's almost like confirmation bias. You try it, feel sore, and you're like, that exercise makes me sore. And it's not really the case. It's more just that you're terrified of it.
We're trying to build that up. So really, this is what it's based around. However, as I say, if you tend to really struggle with your deadlift setup and you tend to then lose position, this might be very beneficial. So I'm going to break it down into a couple of parts. Okay, so initially what I'm going to look to do is talk about the setup of the deadlift, where you should feel it, what tweaks you can make to feel it in the right area, and then how to execute it. And I'm going to do that based on an elevated deadlift. I'm going to make a second video after that. The second video we're going to talk about the more sort of finer points of how to breathe and brace correctly.
Okay, so the first part, going through deadlift setup and having watched it, makes a lot of sense. Talking about each stage. The main thing here is that you really be troubleshooting. So this video I give all the information and necessary for what may happen if you're trying to rebuild your deadlift. But the first thing is do the deadlift and figure out where there's breakdown under stress or heavy loads or when the deadlift gets challenging, and then basically go to the troubleshooting to see what you can do to try and address that, which isn't really highlighted that well.
Set up a good head position for your deadlift, and then how to deadlift from the floor. The reason why I want to do an elevated deadlift is essentially to take out part of the component of the lift from the ground. So when you deadlift from the ground, things change slightly. So we're going to do for an elevated deadlift, so the bar is just below the knees, so we're going to focus on just trying to target hamstrings and that hinge pattern. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of elevated deadlifts just to have an idea, give you an idea of what it looks like, and then discuss things from there.
Okay, so this part's good, so I'm going through an elevated deadlift. To be honest, if I were to do this again, I would probably do it the other way around. I'm kind of working backwards, so going from troubleshooting and reducing down aspects of deadlift to teaching someone a deadlift by going through. To be really, really clear here is, first part is deadlift for a while, figure out what the issues are, or what we kind of do at GTG, you'll go through a movement assessment where you can kind of see limitations and then select an appropriate exercise. So here I'm selecting the elevated deadlift as an easy way to teach the deadlift with someone who's maybe got a really poor hinge or something like that. If you're already a pretty good deadlifter, or you can deadlift, then you're looking to find out where breakdown happens and then troubleshoot from there. But in this case, I'm sort of giving all the information that one could ever need and breaking it down, which is valuable, but it's not got great context behind it.
Okay, so elevated deadlift. In this instance, what we're looking to do to start rebuilding the deadlift, or start, let's say, correcting technique, or even starting from scratch, is start with a bar that's just below knee height. Okay, so the whole part of this lift will just be the hinge. Okay, so it'll just be reaching back into your hips to feel your hamstrings. It won't be about trying to bend the knees. Okay? Okay, and that's the elevated deadlift. Okay, so we covered the elevated deadlift. Basically what is almost a pure hinge pattern. So what I mean by that is that you're just moving through the hips in order to use the hamstrings and the glutes. Okay, isolate the back, okay, and then just reaching back. So there's not really any knee bend or quad involvement, which there is in the deadlift from the ground, but I'll come to that in the next video. So basically what we're trying to do is feel the hamstrings in this instance and feel the glutes. So we're going to build the elevated deadlift to start with that hinge pattern. Okay, so to start from there, to begin trying to feel hamstrings and glutes, we need to start with the position of the spine. So how do you set up? So if you're someone like me, who tends to have a big anterior tilt.
Talking about a big anterior tilt, neutral is definitely it's a term that's used to try and define almost like optimal or ideal, but it's a range. So this, in this case, got a wee bit too much towards neutral being a certain thing to achieve. An anterior tilt's not a big thing, it doesn't actually matter that much. In terms of being able to get the muscles in your back to work as well as the muscles in your front, so that your trunk has the most amount of tension there possible for heavy lifts, is important, but it's not, again, not the be all end all. You could develop one area being really strong, like a really strong back, and not as strong like trunk or abs. And it probably wouldn't matter that much. It's excess that tends to be an issue, and if you get stuck in this position, so if you get stuck in a really extended posture, sometimes it's hard to get out of that. And it basically, if you can't get in and out of a movement or position, that's sometimes not great, especially if you're looking for movement variety. Or in this case, if you're stuck with a big anterior tilt or a big arch in your back, can you bend over and flex your lower back and things? If not, you can build up so much rigidity in there and so much tension that the area essentially just becomes sensitized. There's an awful lot of stress put through and an awful lot of load. It fatigues quickly, then it's put under heavy loads, and there's likelihood then that you may get an injury or something like that because the area is fatigued. So having an anterior tilt, extension-based posture isn't an issue, really, unless you're locked into it and sort of can't get out of it, and you can't move through that position and back out again.
And your pelvis tends to drop forward. You want to essentially try and take yourself out of that position. Or if you're someone with a lot of extension in the upper back, or even if you're very sort of rounded over, you're trying to get to the point where you've got your pelvis and your rib cage aligned. Okay, so stacked on top of each other. I covered this in a previous video when I was talking about breathing and bracing. So if you don't know what I refer to in this, and watch the video on breathing and bracing just to try and cover this, or talk about how to breathe to get a better postural position. So what we're trying to do initially then is set that pelvis to a neutral position, that rib cage to a neutral position, and put your core in the best position to work optimally. Okay, in this extended pattern, it's very hard to engage your anterior core, tend to use a lot more of your lower back. We're here, where it's more neutral, you're able to brace everything around and engage everything 360 degrees, okay? An easy way to get in that position if you struggle with it is take a big breath in, and then a full exhale, breathe out, feel the rib cage come down, and that will engage your obliques here and put you in a more neutral position. Okay, so that's the first thing that we're trying to do, so that when you then hinge, you manage to keep this pattern in this position, and as you reach back, it's all hamstrings, as opposed to going in a lot of extension whenever you're trying to do that hinge pattern. For some people, that'll still be fine, they'll still feel hamstrings. For a lot of people, they're not going to feel hamstrings anymore. It'll maybe become more about calves, or they'll just feel closer towards the knee. So we're trying to get that neutral hip position and neutral rib cage position to start with. So the next part I want to cover is how your foot stance, so your foot width, can affect whether or not you feel hamstrings. So first part is getting that neutral pelvis position, neutral rib cage position, and the next thing is where do your feet need to be in order to feel your hamstrings. So there's a difference between how you stand in terms of stance width and what way you point your feet. Okay, so do you turn out? Okay, and do you take a wider or narrow stance? Initially, what you want to try and feel is what position helps you feel your hamstrings the most. Okay, so just take whatever stance feels comfortable, set that pelvis and ribcage position, and then try the hinge and see how do you feel. Do you feel your hamstrings? If yes, great, try a wee bit narrower, try again. Do you feel the hamstrings more or less? And then try and move out the way. After that, you can do the same thing with foot position.
Okay, so talking about stance width and hip position and feeling your hamstrings, it is pretty key. I mean, once that bar from a deadlift sort of gets to about knee height, like your hamstrings, you sort of be using be doing a lot of the work there. And if you can't use your hamstrings, then that position where you go from your knee to wanting to extend your hips forward, which is pretty much all hamstrings, you want those to engage. Playing about with feet stance can definitely help you feel the hamstrings. So try deadlifting, try going to the point whereby it gets challenging, and find out where breakdown comes. If breakdown comes when the bar gets above your knee, look into the fact if maybe your hamstrings are weak or you find it hard to use them, and then go to this part of the things that I kind of mentioned.
Do you feel out more? Do you feel more hamstring? If you turn your feet in, do you feel more hamstring or less hamstring? Ideally, you probably want to have your feet pointed relatively forward. Okay, because in terms of being able to target both the inside and outside of the hamstrings and get the adductors involved, which I'll talk about in a second, it's going to be harder to do that if your toes are pointed out. But again, the main aspect here is if you feel your hamstrings or not. Usually twisting your feet out will make you more engaged the outside, out of the head of the hamstring, and that's fine, but you're not really going to be involved in the entire muscle, which is essentially what you want to try and do here. Okay, so just play around with foot position, find what's optimal for you, and that's basically how you're going to then determine if you've got your hamstrings engaged or not. A couple of things to look for is what happens with your feet. So when you point your feet straight ahead, do your feet roll in or do your feet roll out? And that will help you determine what to do after that. So I'm going to cover later on in the next video a bit more about how to engage either the glutes or adductors when you do a deadlift. But basically, just to cover that briefly now, just to help, if your feet collapse in, whenever you're standing, your feet are pointing forward, you're going to work more on essentially trying to twist out from your hips and try and engage basically your glutes. If your feet tend to roll out and you get a high arch, you're going to focus more on trying to engage the inside of your thighs and your adductors. If you combine either of those things with that feet stance and that pelvis and ribcage position, that should allow you to get the most out of your hamstrings.
Pretty much everything else in the video is the same idea. It's all troubleshooting methods. So start deadlifting if you can deadlift well, build up until you get the part that's challenging, see where breakdown comes, and then go through this and see where the breakdown occurs and use these tips to kind of work through it. If you can't deadlift very well, figure out why not. Maybe you need an assessment. The external cues part, push the floor away. So ideally, that's a good thing. To be able to push down into the ground is usually to be able to do that in a deadlift requires good positioning. So after a period of time, if you can't push the floor away or use that cue or utilize that cue very well or something similar in a deadlift, that's when again look at what the breakdown is. What are you finding hard? And it could be multiple things, but trying to determine why is that difficult, because in itself it could purely just be setup, or you could go through the checklist of everything I've just said here, but you may need to then modify it in order to be able to get the bar in a position that you can push the floor away as you lift. And this time around, I'd be more inclined to try and start with that in the deadlift and say, let's try this cue, see if it works. If not, let's start troubleshooting. So overall, I think that the video is really, really good in terms of information, but it almost kind of puts the cart before the horse. So it doesn't have context first. So you need context before you utilize these cues or these tips. So the first thing I would do is deadlift. If you can do it safely, or whatever range you can do it safely in. If you maybe need to elevate the bar or something like that off the ground because it's too hard to get to the floor, and then see where breakdown comes and then use one of these tips to try and figure out what can help you break through that plateau or that barrier.
Okay, the next stage we're going to talk about is engaging the lats, okay, which is probably the final point whenever you approach the bar, the last thing maybe you're going to try and or step you're going to go through before you actually lift the bar. So basically what we've gone through so far is trying to get that neutral pelvis and ribcage position, and then adjusting the stance width in the feet position in order to feel your hamstrings, okay? When you do that hinge, you want to feel the hamstrings, okay? When you just do a bodyweight hinge like I am right now, in this position, you don't really need to think an awful lot about your lats. As soon as you go to lift the bar, and there's possibility that bar can swing out away from you, and you're trying to keep your upper body braced, you want to start incorporating the lats. There's a couple of different cues that can be used in terms of thinking about incorporating your lats, and a few other ones that you'll find in maybe different videos. 3 of them are: 1, trying to pull your shoulders away from your ears, trying to pull your shoulders into your front pockets, or trying to pull your shoulders into your back pockets. This is something I would say play around with, but as a general sort of guide, depending on what your setup looks like, if you're someone who tends to naturally go into quite a lot of extension when you deadlift, I wouldn't try and pull your shoulders into your back pockets because it would probably make you extend further. I would try and think more about shoulders in the front pockets. And the other is true, if you tend to go very kyphotic, I would think about trying to pull the shoulders into the back pockets to get a bit more extension in your upper back. So if someone is essentially getting you here and going very extended, that cue of shoulders in the back pockets probably isn't a great idea. Again, it just sort of depends, but what you're really trying to feel is that lat switch on and a good amount of tension in here. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, let's combine all those steps together and then apply that to the elevated deadlift. Okay, so to start off with, the very first thing is to stand tight to the bar when it comes to an elevated deadlift, so shins touching it. Something like this, because it's very much focused on a hinge pattern and trying to feel hamstrings, you have no reason to approach the bar further away. You want this bar just below knee height or somewhere around that area. This bar is probably slightly too low. I want it somewhere around just below the knees. Okay, but there's no real reason to have a forward knee bend. Okay, so bar should be touching. So if you're deadlifting from the floor and the bar hits knee height, you roughly want to have vertical shins, and at that point you're really engaging your hamstrings. So that's where we're going to start this setup from, okay? So the first thing then is, can I get that neutral pelvis and neutral rib cage position? So I'm going to try and use an exhale in order to just basically engage my obliques and pull the rib cage down and feel that position. Okay, so breath in, breathe out, let that come down, hold that tension, engage my glutes as well, which will keep that neutral pelvis position. And then from there, just breathe normally without losing that position. Okay, once that's done, I'm going to try and hinge down to get the bar, but I want to feel my hamstrings. So when I'm going to hinge, I'm going to then play around with foot position and see what position works best for me to feel my hamstrings. Okay, so I'm about there. So a wee bit of pressure inward on the foot, and roughly about hip width apart. Okay. In general, the closer the stance, the closer the hip width it is, the more optimal your range is going to be. Okay, so when you reach down and grab the bar, you tend to take advantage of levers, but it's not the be all and end all. Okay, so hip position, rib cage, trying to feel the hamstrings, and then I'm going to reach down, grab the bar, and try and engage my lats. Again, same with feet stance, whatever sort of grip width helps you feel your lats more. The closer it is to directly underneath your shoulder, the more you're going to take advantage of leverages, but it's not the be all end all. Okay, so those steps. So first off, rib cage, pelvis position, reach back, feel the hamstrings, engage the lats, and then I'm just going to think about trying to stand up with the bar and feel my hamstrings and glutes engage. For something like this, we're working purely on trying to rebuild a deadlift pattern. It's very helpful to think about where you feel it. So an internal cue of trying to feel hamstrings and glutes work. That load gets heavier and becomes a bit more of a challenge. I would start moving towards things like external cues, like thinking about pushing the floor away or something similar to that. But initially, when you're rebuilding your deadlift or you're trying to feel the right areas of work, think about what exactly you're engaged in. It's going to be very helpful. So that's going to be part one of rebuilding the deadlift. And then In part 2, I will go over how to brace properly, talk about head position, how to deadlift from the floor, and then a few common problems and errors that come up.